Before you begin, write in the comments which city and country you're watching us from. This channel exists to record stories that should never have been forgotten. In November 1852, the City Council of Cincinnati, Ohio, held a closed emergency session that was struck from the official minutes. According to a private memo discovered in 2003, the meeting concerned a free black man who had submitted detailed plans for a proposed bridge across the Ohio River. Plans that the city's own engineers had examined and found to be impossibly advanced and decades ahead of current engineering practice. But that wasn't what alarmed the council. What alarmed them was that this man had accompanied his bridge design with predictions, specific warnings about where the city's existing infrastructure would fail, when flooding would occur, and which buildings would collapse in future earthquakes. Within 6 months, 3 of his predictions came true, with uncanny precision. The council faced an impossible situation. They needed his knowledge. His insights could save lives and money. But acknowledging his expertise would require admitting that a black man possessed technical knowledge and foresight that surpassed their white engineers. The decision was documented in a letter marked "Destroy after reading," but accidentally preserved. We must utilize his knowledge while ensuring he receives no credit. His existence as a recognized expert would undermine the natural order. He must remain invisible. For the next decade, this man's predictions and designs were stolen, his warnings were repackaged as the work of white engineers, and his name was systematically erased from every document, until he made one prediction they couldn't ignore and couldn't allow him to survive. What you're about to hear is reconstructed from engineering records with names redacted, newspaper accounts that mentioned an unnamed Negro informant, court testimony sealed for a century, and architectural plans signed only with NP. This is not about prophecy. This is about knowledge so dangerous it had to be buried. Cincinnati in 1852 was a city on the edge, geographically, economically, and politically. Situated on the Ohio River, it marked the boundary between free Ohio and slave Kentucky. The city was booming, growing rapidly as a center of trade and manufacturing, earning the nickname Porkopolis for its massive slaughterhouses and meat-packing industry. But growth brought problems: flooding from the river, inadequate sewage systems, buildings that collapsed under their own weight, and bridges that failed under traffic. In this rapidly expanding city lived a man named Nathaniel Pierce, though like many free black people of the period, his name appears inconsistently in records, sometimes as N. Pierce, sometimes as Nathaniel P., sometimes simply as the colored engineer. He was approximately 35 years old in 1852, born free in Pennsylvania, and had somehow acquired extensive knowledge of engineering, mathematics, and what would later be called systems thinking. How Nathaniel acquired this knowledge remains one of the mysteries of his story. He had no formal education. Universities did not admit black students, and engineering was taught through apprenticeships that were closed to people of color. Yet by the early 1850s, Nathaniel was working as an independent contractor in Cincinnati, taking on projects that white craftsmen either couldn't or wouldn't handle, surveying difficult terrain, designing drainage systems, calculating load-bearing capacities for buildings. His work came to wider attention in June 1852, following a disaster. A newly constructed warehouse on the riverfront collapsed without warning, killing 6 workers and injuring more than 20 others. The building had been designed by a reputable firm, constructed by experienced builders, and inspected by city officials. Its collapse shocked the city and raised questions about the safety of other buildings. A subsequent investigation, documented in city records at the Cincinnati Historical Society, hired several experts to determine the cause of the collapse. Among those consulted was Nathaniel Pierce. According to the investigation report, Nathaniel examined the site and provided an analysis that was both precise and disturbing. He explained that the building had been constructed on filled land, an old creek bed that had been covered over years earlier. The fill had never properly settled, and the weight of the building had caused uneven subsidence, creating stresses that eventually led to structural failure. But Nathaniel went further. He provided the investigators with a list of other buildings in Cincinnati that he believed were at risk for similar failures. He identified 15 structures built on questionable foundations, described the specific risks each faced, and estimated timelines for when failures might occur. The investigators were skeptical. How could this man, with no formal training, make such specific predictions? They brought in Hermann Schmidt, a German-trained civil engineer working in Cincinnati, to evaluate Nathaniel's analysis. Schmidt's report, preserved in the engineering archives, was remarkable. The colored man's assessment is not only correct, it demonstrates understanding of structural mechanics and geological principles that I myself learned only through years of formal study in Germany. His identification of at-risk structures is methodical and appears sound. I cannot explain how he possesses this knowledge, but I can verify that it is accurate. The city quietly inspected the 15 buildings Nathaniel had identified. 12 showed signs of structural problems. 3 were ordered evacuated and demolished before they could fail catastrophically. Lives were saved, but Nathaniel received no public acknowledgement. The official reports credited expert consultation and thorough engineering review without naming him. This pattern, Nathaniel providing crucial insights that were then attributed to others, had actually been ongoing for several years before the warehouse collapse. Research by architectural historians has uncovered numerous projects in Cincinnati from the late 1840s and early 1850s, where Nathaniel's involvement was documented in private correspondence but erased from public records. Before we continue, leave a comment. Have you ever had your work stolen and given to someone else? The warehouse incident, however, brought Nathaniel to the attention of more powerful people. In August 1852, he was approached by representatives of the Cincinnati Covington Bridge Company, which was planning to build a suspension bridge across the Ohio River. The company had hired an engineering firm to design the bridge, but the design was encountering problems. The engineer, Jonas Whitman, wrote in a letter to a colleague, "We have calculated the forces repeatedly, but something in our design is wrong. The bridge will not support the anticipated traffic load. We are at an impasse." Someone, the records don't say who, suggested consulting Nathaniel Pierce. Whitman was initially resistant, but facing mounting pressure from investors, he agreed. Nathaniel was brought to examine the bridge plans under unusual conditions, documented in a contract that surfaced in 2007. He would be paid a modest sum for his consultation, his recommendations would be considered, but he would sign an agreement that he would never claim authorship or credit for any aspect of the design. Nathaniel examined the plans and identified the problem within hours. The design had miscalculated the dynamic loads, the way the bridge would respond to traffic, wind, and temperature changes over time. Nathaniel provided specific modifications, changes to the cable anchoring system, adjustments to the tower design, and alterations to how the deck was suspended. According to Whitman's later notes, Nathaniel didn't just identify problems, he explained them in detail, demonstrating understanding of principles that were at the cutting edge of suspension bridge design. But Nathaniel did something else that would prove even more significant. He warned that the bridge, even with his modifications, would face a specific challenge. In approximately 7 years, likely in late spring, the bridge would experience resonant oscillations during a particular weather condition involving high winds and temperature variation. If not properly dampened, these oscillations could cause catastrophic failure. He recommended installing specific dampening mechanisms and monitoring systems. Whitman documented this warning in his private notes, but dismissed it publicly. How could anyone predict a specific failure 7 years in advance? It seemed absurd. Whitman incorporated Nathaniel's structural modifications. They solved the immediate design problems, but ignored the warning about future oscillations. The bridge was built according to the modified design and opened in 1853. It was hailed as an engineering triumph, credited entirely to Jonas Whitman and his firm. Nathaniel received his consultation fee, $50, a fraction of what white engineers would have been paid for such crucial insights, and returned to obscurity. But his warning was documented, filed away in Whitman's personal papers, noted, and then forgotten. What made Nathaniel remarkable was not just his technical knowledge, though that was extraordinary. It was his ability to project forward, to see how systems would behave over time, to identify points of failure before they occurred. In modern terms, we might call this predictive modeling or systems analysis. But in 1852, such thinking was rare even among trained engineers. Where did this ability come from? The historical evidence provides only fragments. One clue appears in the diary of a Quaker woman named Sarah Hartwell, who ran a small school for free black children in Cincinnati. In an entry from 1848, she wrote, "Young Nathaniel Pierce came to my school today, though he is already a grown man. He asked if he could read our books on mathematics and natural philosophy. I told him he was welcome. He spent hours reading, and when I checked on him, he was not simply reading but copying diagrams and equations into his own notebook, along with his own notations and calculations. He learns by consuming everything he can find, then thinking deeply about what he has learned. I have never seen such intellectual hunger." This entry suggests that Nathaniel was largely self-taught, learning from whatever books he could access, then extending that knowledge through his own reasoning. But even accounting for exceptional intelligence and dedication, his abilities seemed to exceed what self-study alone could produce. He appeared to have intuitive understanding of physical principles, an almost uncanny sense for how structures would behave, how weather patterns would develop, how systems would evolve. By late 1852, Nathaniel's reputation in Cincinnati's black community was growing. Word spread that he could look at a building and tell you if it was safe, look at the river and predict flooding, examine a canal system and explain why it would fail. People sought him out for advice, not just about engineering, but about practical decisions that required understanding of physical systems. Should they build a house on a particular plot of land? Would a new well provide good water? When would the next major flood occur? This last question about flooding became particularly significant in the spring of 1853. The Ohio River flooded regularly, but predicting the severity and timing of floods was difficult. In March 1853, Nathaniel warned anyone who would listen that a major flood was coming in early April, specifically around April 8th to 10, and that it would exceed the worst flooding of the previous decade. White authorities dismissed his warning. There was no meteorological basis for such a prediction. Weather forecasting in 1853 was primitive, based on immediate observations rather than predictive models. Several newspapers ran mocking articles about the colored prophet and his flood warning. The Cincinnati Gazette wrote, "A certain Negro man claims to foresee a great flood. Perhaps he received this knowledge from mystical sources, as his race is often given to superstition. Sensible citizens should ignore such alarmist predictions." But on April 9th, 1853, the Ohio River flooded catastrophically. The water rose to levels not seen in 20 years, inundating the riverfront districts, destroying buildings and causing extensive damage. Nathaniel had been precisely correct, not approximately, not vaguely, but precisely. The flood peaked on April 9th, exactly as he had warned. The accuracy of his prediction was impossible to ignore, but also impossible for white authorities to publicly acknowledge. How had he known? Was it luck? Impossible. The timing was too specific. Was it some kind of mystical ability? That explanation was attractive to some because it allowed them to dismiss his knowledge as supernatural rather than intellectual, maintaining the belief that black people couldn't possess rational scientific understanding. But a few people recognized that Nathaniel's prediction wasn't mystical, it was analytical. He had been observing the river for years, noting patterns in water levels, snowmelt, weather conditions, and seasonal variations. He had been collecting data, though he had no formal training in hydrology or meteorology. He had built a mental model of the river system, and his model worked. After the flood, Nathaniel's warnings were taken more seriously, at least privately. City officials began consulting him unofficially, sending representatives to ask his opinion about infrastructure projects, about flood risks, about structural safety. But these consultations were always off the record. Nathaniel was never invited to official meetings, never included in public discussions, never credited in official documents. This arrangement, utilizing his knowledge while keeping him invisible, suited the city's white leadership. They could benefit from his insights without the discomfort of publicly acknowledging a black man as an authority. But it created a moral and practical problem. They were essentially stealing his intellectual property, taking his predictions and his designs, and claiming them as their own, or attributing them to white engineers. Nathaniel understood what was happening. According to testimony given decades later by his friend, a barber named William Johnson, Nathaniel was frustrated but pragmatic. Johnson recalled, Nathaniel knew they were using him. He knew they'd never give him credit, but he also knew that if his knowledge could prevent deaths, prevent disasters, then it was worth giving even without recognition. He told me once, I'd rather save lives anonymously than watch people die to protect my pride. But it ate at him, the injustice of it. The situation escalated in late 1853 when Nathaniel did something that would ultimately seal his fate. He began documenting his knowledge systematically, writing it down in detailed notebooks. According to fragmentary evidence, these notebooks contained detailed observations of the Ohio River, with predictions of flood patterns for years in advance, structural analyses of dozens of buildings in Cincinnati, identifying weaknesses and predicting failures, designs for improved bridge and building systems, incorporating principles that wouldn't become standard practice for decades, observations about weather patterns and their effects on construction and infrastructure. Nathaniel's motivation for creating these notebooks is unclear. Perhaps he wanted to preserve his knowledge for future generations. Perhaps he hoped to eventually publish his findings if social conditions changed. Perhaps he simply needed to organize his thoughts, to externalize the vast amount of information he carried in his mind. But the existence of these notebooks became known to white authorities in early 1854, and they were immediately alarmed. Written documentation of Nathaniel's knowledge was more dangerous than his spoken consultations. Written documents could be distributed, could fall into the hands of abolitionists, could be used as evidence of black intellectual capacity. Moreover, if Nathaniel's predictions continued to prove accurate and were documented in his own hand, dated and specific, they would constitute undeniable proof of his expertise. In March 1854, Nathaniel's rooms were searched under dubious legal pretenses. A warrant was obtained claiming he was suspected of harboring fugitive slaves. No fugitives were found, but his notebooks were seized. According to court records discovered in 1998, the notebooks were handed over to city engineers, who examined them and were reportedly astonished by their content. An internal memo, written by the city engineer Nathaniel Crawford and marked confidential, stated, "The Negro Pierce's notebooks contain engineering insights of remarkable sophistication. His analysis of the existing sewage system identifies precisely the problems we have struggled with for years. His proposals for improvement are ingenious. More disturbing, his predictions about infrastructure failures are specific and numerous. If even a fraction prove accurate, it will be evident that this man possesses technical knowledge exceeding that of our own engineers. This is an intolerable situation. We must prevent these notebooks from becoming public. The city never returned Nathaniel's notebooks. Officially, they were lost. In reality, they were kept by the city engineering department, consulted privately for years, used to inform infrastructure planning and design, but never acknowledged. Nathaniel's knowledge, stolen from his own documentation, continued to benefit the city while he remained unrecognized. But the theft of the notebooks was only the beginning. In May 1854, something happened that made Nathaniel's continued existence untenable for Cincinnati's white establishment. He made a prediction that was too specific and too disturbing to ignore. According to multiple sources, including a letter from Jonas Whitman to a colleague and testimony from William Johnson, Nathaniel warned that Cincinnati would experience a major earthquake in late October or early November 1854. He specified that the earthquake would cause severe damage to buildings in certain districts and that several structures he had previously identified as at risk would collapse completely. Earthquake prediction in 1854 was impossible. It remains difficult even today. Nathaniel's claims seem not just improbable but insane. However, Nathaniel had been precisely correct about other predictions, so his warning could not be entirely dismissed. City officials faced a dilemma. If they took his warning seriously and ordered evacuations or building inspections, they would have to acknowledge him as a source of reliable information. If they ignored his warning and he was correct, people might die, and the city would face liability for ignoring known risks. They chose a middle path. They quietly inspected some of the buildings Nathaniel had flagged, found structural problems, and ordered repairs, but they publicly denied that any earthquake was expected. Meanwhile, they began looking for ways to neutralize Nathaniel as a source of disruptive predictions. The earthquake occurred on November 9th, 1854. It was not a major earthquake by modern standards, approximately magnitude 4.5 to 5.0, but it was significant enough to cause damage in Cincinnati. And critically, the damage followed Nathaniel's predictions almost exactly. Buildings he had identified as vulnerable collapsed or suffered severe damage. Areas he had said would be most affected were most affected. His prediction had been vindicated once again, and this time too many people had known about it in advance for it to be quietly buried. Newspaper accounts from November 1854, preserved in the Cincinnati Historical Society archives, describe the earthquake and its damage. Some articles mention, euphemistically, that certain structures previously identified by local observers as potentially vulnerable had collapsed. One article in a German-language newspaper was more explicit, stating that the free Negro man who had warned of this earthquake with such precision should be consulted by the city about other potential dangers. This public acknowledgement, even limited and in a foreign-language newspaper, was dangerous. It suggested that a black man possessed knowledge that white authorities lacked. It implied that his warnings should be heeded. It threatened the racial hierarchy that insisted black people were intellectually inferior to whites. Within weeks, Nathaniel found himself targeted by a coordinated campaign of harassment and suppression. He received threatening letters warning him to stop making predictions. He was excluded from jobs he had previously been hired for. Former clients were warned not to employ him. And most ominously, rumors began to circulate that he was mentally unstable, that his predictions were the result of delusions, that he was potentially dangerous. These rumors had a purpose. They created a pretext for institutionalization. In 19th century America, free black people who challenged the social order could be declared insane and confined to asylums with minimal legal process. The diagnosis of delusions of grandeur, believing oneself to possess knowledge or abilities beyond one's station, was commonly applied to black people who aspired to education or claimed expertise. In January 1855, Nathaniel was arrested. The charge, according to court records, was disturbing the peace and creating public alarm through false prophecies. The case was prosecuted by the city attorney's office, which argued that Nathaniel's predictions, even when accurate, were socially disruptive and could not be tolerated. The prosecution did not dispute that his predictions had been correct. They argued that accuracy was irrelevant, that a black man claiming to foresee future events was inherently destabilizing to public order. Nathaniel defended himself. He could not afford an attorney and was not provided one. According to a court transcript discovered in 2009, Nathaniel's defense was rational and measured. He explained that his predictions were not prophecies, but analyses based on observation and calculation. He offered to explain his methods, to show how he arrived at his conclusions. He argued that knowledge should be judged by its accuracy, not by the race of the person who possesses it. The judge was unmoved. In his ruling, Judge Marcus Whitley stated, "The defendant, though he claims his predictions arise from observation and reason, cannot adequately explain how a man of his race and station has acquired such knowledge. His claims to possess expertise in engineering, meteorology, and geological science are not credible, given that he has had no formal education in these fields." More troubling, his continued insistence that he can foresee future events creates unrest and false hope among the colored population. For the public good and for his own welfare, I hereby order that the defendant be remanded to the custody of the Longview Asylum for evaluation and treatment. Nathaniel was institutionalized in February 1855. The asylum, located outside Cincinnati, was a grim place. Conditions were documented years later during a state investigation. Overcrowding, inadequate food, abusive staff, and treatments that included prolonged isolation, cold water immersions, and physical restraints. For patients of color, conditions were even worse. They were segregated into inferior wards and received minimal care. Asylum records, discovered in the Ohio State Archives in 1987, show that Nathaniel remained institutionalized for over 3 years. During that time, he was diagnosed with various forms of mental illness, monomania, melancholia, delusions of exceptional ability. These diagnoses were not based on actual mental illness, but on his refusal to recant his claims of expertise and his continued insistence that his predictions were based on rational analysis. One doctor at the asylum, William Morrison, kept detailed notes on Nathaniel's case. These notes, found among Morrison's papers donated to the Cincinnati Medical Heritage Center, reveal a doctor struggling with cognitive dissonance. Morrison wrote, "The patient Pierce continues to insist he possesses engineering and scientific knowledge. To test this claim, I showed him an architectural diagram and asked him to identify any problems with the design. He immediately pointed out several structural issues that I later confirmed with a consulting engineer were indeed present. This suggests the patient's claims are not delusional. However, I cannot conclude that a Negro man of no formal education possesses such knowledge through rational means. I must consider whether there is some form of idiot savant phenomenon at work, where the patient has developed narrow abilities through unknown mechanisms." Morrison's notes document similar tests. Nathaniel was repeatedly asked to demonstrate his knowledge and repeatedly proved capable of sophisticated technical analysis. But each time, Morrison found reasons to dismiss the evidence. Perhaps Nathaniel had somehow memorized information without understanding it. Perhaps he was lucky. Perhaps his abilities were some kind of anomaly that didn't represent real intelligence. The asylum records also document something else. Nathaniel continued to make predictions even while institutionalized. He warned asylum staff that a particular building on the grounds was unsound and would collapse. The warning was ignored, dismissed as another delusion. 6 months later, that building collapsed during a storm, injuring 3 patients. There is no record that anyone connected this to Nathaniel's warning. In March 1858, Nathaniel was released from the asylum. The discharge notes state he was sufficiently docile to be returned to society, though continued observation is recommended. He returned to Cincinnati, but he was not the same man. 3 years of institutionalization, of being told repeatedly that his knowledge was impossible and his abilities were delusions, had taken a toll. William Johnson, Nathaniel's friend, described his condition in testimony given in 1899. When Nathaniel came out of that asylum, something had broken in him. He still knew things. You could see it in his eyes, but he wouldn't speak about them anymore. People would ask him questions, ask for advice, and he'd just shake his head. He told me once, "They win. If I speak truth, they call me insane. If I stay silent, I survive, but survival isn't living." He existed, but he'd given up trying to make the world hear him. Nathaniel lived for another 7 years after his release from the asylum. He worked odd jobs, janitorial work, dock labor, whatever he could find. He no longer offered predictions or engineering advice. According to city directory listings, he moved frequently, living in progressively poorer circumstances. Whatever earnings he had saved before his institutionalization had been exhausted by legal fees and the costs of his confinement. Families of asylum patients were charged for their care. One incident from this period is documented. In 1859, Nathaniel witnessed a building collapse that killed 2 workers. Bystanders who knew him asked if he had foreseen this collapse. According to a newspaper account, Nathaniel replied, "Yes, I knew it would fall. I said nothing because no one listens to what I know, and speaking only brings me harm. I've learned my lesson. I will watch the world destroy itself rather than suffer again for trying to prevent it." This quote, if accurately reported, captures the tragedy of Nathaniel's story. He possessed knowledge that could have saved lives, prevented disasters, and advanced engineering practice. But that knowledge was stolen, suppressed, and ultimately silenced, not because it was false, but because acknowledging it would have required white society to admit that a black man could know more than they did. Nathaniel died in July 1865, just months after the end of the Civil War, at approximately age 48. His death was documented in the city records with a terse entry: Nathaniel Pierce, colored, deceased, no known relatives, buried Potter's Field. No obituary was published. No one at the time noted that Cincinnati had lost one of the most remarkable analytical minds of the 19th century. For more than 100 years, Nathaniel's story was completely forgotten. The bridge he helped design remained standing, credited to Jonas Whitman. The buildings that were saved because of his warnings stood without anyone knowing why they had been inspected and repaired. His predictions, proven accurate again and again, were attributed to luck or to the white engineers who had stolen his insights. The recovery of Nathaniel's story began in the 1980s, when architectural historians researching Cincinnati's 19th century infrastructure began noticing anomalies in the records. Buildings were documented as having been inspected and repaired with no clear explanation for why. Engineering decisions were made that seemed ahead of their time, with no documentation of how the engineers had arrived at those solutions. And occasionally, in private correspondence, there were references to the colored man's advice or consultation with NP. Dr. Thomas Reed, a historian at the University of Cincinnati, began investigating these references. Reed found the court case documenting Nathaniel's institutionalization, Jonas Whitman's private papers, including his notes on Nathaniel's bridge consultation, and his warning about resonant oscillations, city engineering records with Nathaniel's name redacted, but his analyses preserved asylum records documenting his 3-year confinement. William Johnson's 1899 testimony given to a researcher studying free black communities. But the most remarkable discovery came in 1995 when Reed learned that Nathaniel's confiscated notebooks still existed. His work, published in 1989 in a paper titled The Invisible Engineer, Black Technical Expertise in Antebellum Cincinnati, pieced together Nathaniel's story from fragments scattered across multiple archives. They had never been destroyed, as claimed, but had been kept in the archives of the Cincinnati Public Works Department. For 141 years, they had sat in a storage room, occasionally consulted by engineers, but never acknowledged publicly. The notebooks contained detailed structural calculations that were mathematically sound and demonstrated understanding of engineering principles, predictions of infrastructure failures, many of which could be correlated with actual failures in subsequent years, original designs for bridge and building systems that anticipated innovations that wouldn't become standard until the late 19th or early 20th century. Observations about geology, hydrology, and seismology that showed systematic data collection and analysis. One particularly striking example: in his notebooks, Nathaniel had written a warning dated 1852 about the suspension bridge he helped design. Reed obtained permission to examine the notebooks. His analysis, published in 1997, confirmed what earlier sources had suggested. Nathaniel's technical knowledge was extraordinary. He predicted that in late spring, year 7 after construction, during high wind and warm temperature following cold nights, the bridge will experience oscillations that could cause failure without dampening. The bridge was completed in 1853. In May 1860, 7 years later, the bridge experienced severe oscillations during a windstorm, with conditions matching Nathaniel's description. The bridge did not fail completely, but it was damaged and required emergency repairs. Engineers at the time could not explain why the oscillations occurred. Nathaniel had predicted it precisely and had recommended preventive measures that were never implemented. Reed's analysis concluded Nathaniel Pierce possessed technical knowledge and analytical abilities that were at least equal to, and in some respects superior to, the formally trained engineers of his time. His ability to collect observational data, identify patterns, build predictive models, and apply engineering principles suggest a mind of exceptional capability. The systematic suppression of his expertise represents not just individual injustice, but a historical loss. Innovations that could have advanced engineering practice were buried because they came from a black man. Reed's work sparked renewed interest in Nathaniel's story. Other historians began investigating, finding additional documents and corroborating evidence. In 1999, an engineering professor at Ohio State, Dr. Jennifer Walsh, published a paper analyzing Nathaniel's bridge modifications and concluded that they reflected sophisticated understanding of dynamic loading and resonance, concepts that were poorly understood in the 1850s and wouldn't become central to bridge engineering until after several catastrophic failures in the late 19th century. In 2003, Cincinnati's City Council, prompted by Reed's research and advocacy from local historians, issued a formal acknowledgement of Nathaniel Pierce's contributions to the city's infrastructure. The statement read, "The city of Cincinnati acknowledges that Nathaniel Pierce, a free black man, provided crucial engineering expertise in the mid-19th century that saved lives, prevented disasters, and contributed to the city's development. His expertise was utilized while his identity was suppressed. His predictions were proven accurate while he was declared insane. His knowledge was stolen while he was denied recognition. This treatment was unjust and represented a profound failure of our city to honor merit regardless of race. We remember Nathaniel Pierce not as a prophet or a miracle, but as what he was: a brilliant engineer whose contributions deserve acknowledgement. In 2006, the Cincinnati Suspension Bridge, which Nathaniel had helped design but never received credit for, was officially renamed the Pierce-Whitman Bridge, acknowledging both the black engineer whose modifications made it structurally sound and the white engineer who had received sole credit for 150 years. In 2011, a portion of Nathaniel's notebooks were published in a scholarly edition, with extensive annotations explaining the technical content and historical context. The publication confirmed what Reed had argued. Nathaniel's knowledge was not mystical or supernatural. It was the result of careful observation, systematic data collection, mathematical analysis, and intuitive understanding of physical systems. His predictions appeared uncanny only because he was thinking about systems in ways that most engineers of his era were not. One engineer who reviewed the notebook stated, "Pierce was doing what we would now call predictive modeling or risk assessment. He was collecting data about infrastructure, observing patterns of failure, and using those observations to predict where and when future failures would occur." This approach is standard practice in modern engineering, but in the 1850s, it was revolutionary. Pierce was decades ahead of his time, not because of mystical foresight, but because he was thinking systematically about systems in ways that formal engineering education of his era did not teach. The story of why Nathaniel was suppressed is, in many ways, more important than the story of his abilities. He was suppressed because his knowledge was undeniable. If he had been less capable, if his predictions had been vague or frequently wrong, he could have been safely ignored. But his precision, his repeated accuracy, his demonstrable expertise, these made him dangerous. Because if a black man with no formal education could possess technical knowledge equal to or exceeding that of university-trained white engineers, then the entire justification for racial hierarchy collapsed. If Nathaniel could do this, then how many other black people possessed abilities that were being suppressed? If knowledge and ability were not determined by race, then what justified slavery, segregation, and discrimination? These were questions that white society in the 1850s could not afford to entertain, and so Nathaniel had to be made invisible. His work could be used, it was too valuable to waste, but he could not be acknowledged. His predictions could be proven correct again and again, but he could not be recognized as the source. And when his very existence became too disruptive, when too many people knew about his abilities, he had to be removed entirely through institutionalization. This pattern, utilizing black knowledge while denying black humanity, was not unique to Nathaniel. Enslaved people with technical skills were routinely exploited for their expertise while being denied education or recognition. Free black craftsmen and artisans faced systematic barriers to establishing their own businesses or receiving credit for their work. The economic value of black knowledge was recognized and extracted, but the human dignity of black knowledge holders was denied. Nathaniel's story illustrates this pattern with unusual clarity because his case was so well documented. The white men who suppressed him felt compelled to write about him, to justify their actions, to explain why this threat had to be neutralized. And in doing so, they created the very evidence that would later expose their injustice. In recent years, Nathaniel's story has been taught in some engineering programs as a case study in how social prejudice can obstruct technical knowledge. Students examine his notebooks, analyze his predictions, and discuss the mechanisms by which his expertise was suppressed. These discussions often reveal uncomfortable truths about how the engineering profession has historically excluded people based on race, gender, and class, and how that exclusion has limited innovation and progress. One particularly poignant aspect of Nathaniel's legacy is what remains unknown. His notebooks document only a fraction of his knowledge. They were seized before he had finished compiling his observations, and undoubtedly there was much he never wrote down. What other predictions might he have made? What other engineering innovations might he have developed? What disasters might he have prevented if his warnings had been heeded? These questions cannot be answered. The potential Nathaniel represented was largely unrealized, destroyed by a society that feared his capabilities more than it valued them. And he was not unique. He represents countless others whose potential was similarly destroyed, whose stories were even more thoroughly erased, whose names are lost to history. But Nathaniel's story did survive. Through the fragments he left, the notebooks that were seized but not destroyed, the court records that documented his persecution, the private correspondence of the men who used his knowledge while suppressing his identity, we can reconstruct what happened. We can see how brilliance was treated as pathology, how expertise was treated as presumption, how knowledge was treated as threat. And we can recognize that this was not an accident or an oversight, but a system functioning as designed. The suppression of Nathaniel Pierce was not a failure of justice. It was justice operating according to the logic of racial hierarchy. When a black man demonstrated abilities that challenged racial ideology, that ideology had to be preserved, even if it meant destroying an invaluable mind. Nathaniel understood this. In one of the last entries in his notebooks, written shortly before they were confiscated, he reflected on his situation. I see what others do not see. I know what others do not know. But this knowledge brings no honor, no security, only danger. They take what I know while denying I can know it. They use my insights while calling me deluded. They steal my work while imprisoning me for claiming it as mine. This is the peculiar fate of the colored man who thinks to be simultaneously too valuable to ignore and too dangerous to acknowledge. I do not know if future generations will understand what has been lost in this waste of human capability, but I record what I can in hope that someday someone will know that I existed, that I knew, and that I was silenced not because my knowledge was false, but because it was true. These words, written in 1854, proved prophetic. Future generations, our generation, have found his records. We do understand what was lost, and we recognize that his silencing was both a personal tragedy and a historical crime. The documents exist, the notebooks have been recovered, the bridge he helped design still stands, and Nathaniel Pierce, though deliberately erased for a century and a half, is erased no longer. His story serves as testament to human potential, to the resilience of truth, and to the destructive power of systems that value ideology over evidence, prejudice over merit, and comfortable lies over uncomfortable facts. If this story moved you, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Share your thoughts in the comments about other histories that deserve to be recovered. These stories matter. They change how we understand the past and inform how we build the future.